morning, everyone. Welcome to our little Merchant of Venice lecture here this morning. How are we all doing? I know you can't respond. I'm sorry. But welcome to the lecture. Just at the moment, you'll be able to see as I start the introductory stuff. At the moment, you'll see on your screen, obviously me, the slides, but just below you should see a little poll that's asking where you're tuning in from. So I'd just like to get a sense of where you guys are tuning in from. So because this is a national lecture, we're pulling from, as I can see, New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland. So it just helps to give me a sense of what unit you're doing. I'm from New South Wales, so in terms of me, I'll be able to drop some more information on the human experience side of things. Not so much with Victoria and Queensland. But it's more, to be honest, I've done this out of force of habit. It's more relevant when I'm taking the Tempest and therefore have a comparative for the New South Wales kids, and same with the Crucible. Victoria, it's comparative. So it's not as big a deal here unless it is a comparative and I'm wrong. Please feel free to tell me that. So it just is it's a good sense for me, basically. So we seem to be strongly coming in from New South Wales. That's all good. As I said, it doesn't make a massive difference. It just, knowledge is power, right? The other thing, I'm just going to apologize up front. I'm just having someone come in. I'm in the office. I have a window right there. Someone will be coming in to whippersnipper my lawn. And it might get a bit noisy, in which case I'll jump up and shut the window, but, just to give you a heads up in case I jump up. Okay. So it's the second day of ATAR Notes lectures, so some of you may have attended some yesterday, but in case you haven't, hi, welcome. We're ATAR Notes, as you can see, and as you probably figured out when you signed up. We like to offer a bunch of resources that are effectively making your HSC, VCE, QCE easier. A less stressful, hopefully, experience that's designed for students. So we have a bunch of free resources because, as we know, high school, you're pretty cash strapped. So we have heaps of notes you can download, obviously these lectures, and then a bunch of kind of discussions online. So online Q&As, online kind of forums where you can ask people, hey, I have this thought, we're doing this in class, and someone else can respond, or a past student might also respond. We also have things like newsletters and articles that will come out in those newsletters that might be, a guide to smashing your English analysis or something like that. So totally free, not heaps of spammy emails. We won't freak you out by saying the HSC is only X amount of months away. But yeah, so that's us. We're ATAR Notes. I'm also going to discuss in a bit some of our other resources, which are still really affordable, but they are, paid for. But I won't get into that too much now, but it's about study guides, tutoring, stuff like that. I'm guessing unless heaps of people flood this stream, which I don't think is going to happen at 10 in the morning, we're coming in primarily from New South Wales. Just out of curiosity, I'd just like to see something as well. Apparently I can't type. Save and launch. So this is really more for me to get a sense of like what level you guys are at. I'm imagining 99% here is going to be year 12, which is totally fine. Just so I can see a little bit about what's the take. Actually, that's a lot more year 11 than I expected. So there's some eager folks here this morning. We are going to be majority year 12, but there is some eager beans, I guess. So again, that doesn't necessarily change my presentation, but it is just good for me to keep in the back of my mind, especially when I'm talking about things like analysis and the level you should be at. I don't want to freak any year 11s out, right? So I'm going to caveat some stuff, but it's not going to make a massive difference. In the meantime, let's actually get started on this lovely, it's not a Monday morning, is it? I said that. This lovely Tuesday morning. I'm Bella. So I graduated 3 years ago in 2019, and I studied 3 units of English. I really loved it. I did not do the Merchant of Venice in year 12, but I had previously done it. And I'm currently studying at UNSW doing law and PPE. So if you want to ask any questions about that, you are also more than welcome to ask any questions. In the news for today, this is effectively how our lecture is going to look. So it's a 2-hour lecture, so they're roughly going to be, 50-minute blocks, I would say, so that I can have a little break in the middle because I'm doing 3 lectures today. If you're also doing the Crucible, which if you're in New South Wales, you won't be, I'm doing that lecture next, and then there's also an essay writing lecture just for an hour this evening. I'm running that. It's a pretty good lecture. It's brand new. I made the slides last week and they look pretty schmick, if I do say so myself. But in the meantime, this is how the Crucible lecture, the Merchant of Venice lecture is going to work today. Block 1, we're just going to start with an overview, and that can go to context, but also generally, like, in case you haven't read the text yet, or you maybe need a refresher from having such a fantastic holiday break, we'll go over a bit of the plot. Why does it matter? What's going on, basically? Why do we even bother studying the Merchant of Venice, right? Block 2, we can see, we're going to look into the more analytical side. Block 1, also a bit of character analysis. So again, going to the more description-y side of things. More an overview, block 1. Block 2 is, I would say, the analytical block. We're going to look at the language features. We're going to discuss them for a bit. Then we're going to look also at the key themes. And I think I've listed about 6 key themes. Most of your essays will have 3 or 4. So we've over-prepared for today, which is fantastic. And in fact, I think there are probably some other themes that could probably be discussed. And then we're going to do a little discussion at the end about how to implement this all in practice. I'll discuss a bit about, from a New South Wales lens, about human experience stuff. But as I said, that's not going to be consistent throughout the lecture. It'll just be towards the end. So New South Wales kids keep tuning in. Queensland and Victorian kids, don't stress. I'm not going to make this not for you guys. So that's when you copy slides across. That was a bit embarrassing. Okay. Let's have a quick discussion first as well. What are our thoughts on The Merchant of Venice? Or our thoughts we had prior to reading it? Whatever. What's our thoughts so far? We're at, most of you, or if you're in New South Wales, Queensland, you finished a term already of Year 12. Most of you in, say, New South Wales, have probably already studied this. You're moving on to Mod A or Mod B this term, right? Or maybe a smidgen of Mod C to start off with. It's mixed. No one's being brave enough to say they love it yet, but let's have a thought. What's our opinions on this text? It's a pretty interesting Shakespeare text because it doesn't have the usual, it's very different. We don't really have anyone likable in this text, to be honest. Not that Shakespeare is known for writing particularly likable characters. So what are our thoughts? We're getting a lot of it's all right, basically. So we've either got people who love it, people who really hate it, or our majority in the middle saying like, it's all right. Which is great. That's fine. You can be neutral. And hopefully by the end of this lecture, I might be able to convince you to... I haven't really included a mid-ground between it's all right and love it. So maybe there'll be a mid-ground. You can be like, I'm getting there, on the way to being happy about studying this text. But let's get into it, hey? So, first off, context. Shakespeare is obviously, everyone has studied Shakespeare probably a few times up to this point in Year 12 or Year 11 if you're in Year 11. It's... By the end of studying Shakespeare a few times, you can often feel like you're just repeating the same stuff, right? Great chain of being, natural order, divine right of kings, stuff like that, right? A bit about, maybe you'll be like, women were really oppressed. Yeah, if you're studying Othello, you get a bit spicier, maybe bringing up race there. But, on the whole, it can feel a bit boring repeating Shakespearean context, right? You're probably studying Macbeth, that was all about the great chain of being. Maybe Othello, or Macbeth, also Divine Right of Kings. Othello got a bit spicy, and then you're kind of like, okay, cool, I get it. Elizabethan era kind of sucked, but is it Elizabethan or Jacobean, right? Let's think about this. This, I think, Merchant of Venice is probably the more interesting representation of Shakespearean context. A lot of with, again, probably the exception of Othello, but Othello's a bit different in that regard. Most or a lot of Shakespearean texts are set either within parts of what we now know as the United Kingdom, or other parts of close-ish Europe, Denmark, Scotland, etc. Sometimes England as well, if we're throwing in a bit of history there. It's familiar, and often you'll use that analysis about Shakespeare setting it close to England, but not too close to England, to draw the comparisons and also maybe spook the monarchs just a little bit into behaving better. Very common analysis. You're not incorrect at all for saying something like that. That's basically what you need to do. Merchant of Venice comes with a little bit of a caveat to that, though, because Venice is in no way similar to London. I mean, it's similar in the fact that it's a big city, it's, diverse-ish, but not a heap. It's a trading post, it's not necessarily the closest comparison. It is, in comparison to Shakespeare in England, a bit of an exotic, faraway land. It's a bit like, oh, what are those Italians getting up to? The Venetians at this point, obviously. It wasn't necessarily a one-to-one copy that Shakespeare could be like, if it happens in this society, it'll happen in our society. And that's the point. Shakespeare is putting out a land where these events can be possible, maybe suggesting that London or England are able to change in order to improve, potentially, or have this ability to defy social norms without necessarily being punished for it. We know that Shakespeare was a big fan of upholding social norms and social structures while also kind of being a little bit sly. We know he was funded basically by the Tudors at this point, so he can't be too controversial. He has to kind of toe the line a bit. So setting it in a place like Venice, which enables this, it's far away, we can kind of say what we want, gives Shakespeare the ability to kind of play around with what is accepted and what should be accepted. And we can kind of see that play out within The Merchant of Venice, right? We have these examples of rigid social structures that can kind of be broken down a bit. Race relations, look, as I'm actually going to get you guys to have a little bit of discussion about, sometimes in a progressive manner, sometimes not. It's a bit of a piece of contention with this. However, this Merchant still allows Shakespeare to kind of say there is a world where women are powerful, shock horror, and are able to kind of save the day. There is a world where Jewish and non-Jewish people can get married. There is a world in which Christians are able to be morally better, which are all very important. Shakespeare's not outright saying, hey, the monarch sucks, because no one in England would say that really straight up, even today, but it allows him to kind of say maybe a better world is possible. And to go back, I've done the dot points out of order here, but this is still an Elizabethan era text. I've said in the middle of the Elizabethan era. It's not quite in the middle, but it is firmly an Elizabethan text. Some of you may be studying other texts or have studied other texts that are like, maybe they're Jacobean because they're in like 16 something or other. It's no stress to refer to that as Elizabethan because the start of the Jacobean era and like most of the Elizabethan era are fairly similar. Not a lot is changing unless you're talking about like witches, in which case James really loved them. But yeah, this is certainly firmly Elizabethan. So I want to actually, again, throw the floor for just a second. And I just want to put out this question, which is, what our opinions are on the value of a problematic text, so-called. Now, I'm sure the discussion has come up for you guys in class about whether The Merchant of Venice is a racist text. Is it a problematic kind of depiction? Is it, Shakespeare is preaching kind of tolerance in this text, but also is he being so? Now, you probably all have an opinion on this, or if you haven't derived an opinion, I would suggest just have a think about it. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to come up in your exams, but it will help you kind of understand the place for the Merchant of Venice within modern day literature. So it's a very common question with a lot of texts. So very famous texts, which if you're doing extension English in New South Wales, you may have read. You may have also read it if you have, called Heart of Darkness, which is seen as one of the first post-colonial texts. But when you look back on it, it's probably not really progressive. But it was progressive at its time. So do we still teach it and learn from it? Or do we say, look, just like the views are from that period, the lessons are kind of for that period too. So in terms of, like, say, the depictions of Shylock as this evil caricature, and the fact that, you know, these modern explorations of the caricature, does it hold relevance, or can we only kind of see this villainous character that has been created to be villainous? So this is about for you guys to think, have a chat with your friends or your teacher or something, but it will hopefully enrich a bit of your understanding of the text. So it helps us to provide insight into the understanding of one's perspective. It could teach us what not to do, is what someone said. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it gives us, it shows us what the perspective was back then and what the lessons learned back then had to be phrased around. But it can still say, you know, just like as how we shouldn't behave as characters in the text, looking back on it, we probably shouldn't behave or express things in the same way that maybe Shakespeare does. So it gives us insight into the past, and as someone else has said, it shows us the anti-Semitic nature of the past and how the social structure affects the society. Absolutely right. So we can still see, we can almost see, like, just in the way that anti-Semitism has totally influenced Shylock's life and Jessica's life, we can see how it also permeated Shakespeare's interpretation, even from a progressive lens. Yeah, really good. Yeah, so thank you for sharing. If you want to keep sharing, like, you absolutely can. But as I said, this is also just for you guys to have a think about. I know it maybe seems a bit nerdy to be like, oh, you know, make sure you think about your text. Like, just have it. Everyone loves chatting about English, right, all the time. But just having a think will help you have that better understanding. Being able to, I think one of the big things to build a connection with your text in English, and I think a lot of people sometimes don't feel connected to their text, and that's totally fine because sometimes the texts feel a bit disconnected. The texts you feel a connection to and feel passionate about, you will almost always do better in. And that doesn't have to be a genuine passion. It can be, you know, manufactured to an extent. So if you are thinking of a big idea about the text, you're more likely to feel invested in it and feel like you want to give an opinion. So matters like this, like, is Merchant of Venice still worthwhile studying? Why do we bother still studying it? Having that kind of opinion can allow you to feel a bit more invested in the arguments you're making, because you understand the text a bit better. So I had a very similar circumstance with The Tempest as a text. Again, another Shakespeare text. Shakespeare texts are sometimes hard to feel connected to, right? And I didn't care about it, and I was doing it was a comparative study to a modern version of the text, and I just didn't care. Because I thought, to be honest, The Tempest is not the most interesting Shakespeare play. It's kind of not one of the fun murder and mayhem ones. The book that was the comparative just wasn't great. And it was a cash grab, you know. So it was really hard to be like, okay, what's the purpose for especially the second book? And being able to think and draw some really weird ideas out just made me feel like I cared, even though I still don't like that text. So someone said that it helps us reflect on our own views and values of race, gender, class, morality. Absolutely. And how that might, like, interpret our understanding of things. And then we have, I think that is valuable in the sense it gives modern audiences an understanding of the history and prejudice which can therefore allow people to learn how people are multifaceted and we can move forward towards a different, more accepting, less prejudiced society. Yeah, really great summary. That multifaceted nature of people. So Shakespeare is being relatively progressive, but there's still not progressive elements, and that's okay. We can use this understanding, recognize and draw connections between similar flaws in today's society, especially with other examples of discrimination here today. Absolutely. Especially other stereotypes and things like that. Really good job, guys. So that was our contextual discussion for today. Let's get into a bit of a plot summary. So I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with or understand the plot, hopefully. But if not, let's do a rundown. So I have put aside in this case the kind of Portia subplot, which I'll discuss in just a second, because it's a very interconnected text, right? Everything kind of like, something starts like Portia kind of starts it, or Bassanio with Portia starts it, which then leads us into Antonio, which leads us into Shylock, which leads us back to Portia. Like, you know, it's a bit loopy, right? It's a bit hard to do numbered. A mind map probably would have been better, but quite frankly, I don't like doing digital mind maps because I'm too much of a perfectionist. But it effectively starts with Portia Portia's father has died. She is looking to take a suitor. The deal that her father made was that they have to follow some type of riddle and they have to be basically worthy to win Portia's hand. Portia is super respectful. She's an independent woman, but also she loves her dad. So she is going to respect his wishes. The wishes being there are 3 caskets, or little casks, I should say, gold, silver, and like copper. I can't remember. That's not it. It's wood or something. I can't remember the actual vibes of the caskets. That's not the point. The point is they seem to be descending in wealth order. Whoever picks the correct one will be able to win her hand in marriage. We're seeing a bit the contextual stuff there. That's a bit oof. I'm just getting the colors right because otherwise I will be really angry. Gold, silver, or lead. Not copper. Apologies. Lead. Thank you. And someone's put that up. Good. I'm just going to respond. Hang on. Thank you, everyone. But he needs money. He needs to get to Portia. She's in a different part of the city. And obviously he needs to be able to finance it and also flex on Portia a bit, right? He doesn't have money. Bassanio lives a very lavish lifestyle, and that's also partially why he wants Portia. Portia will allow him to keep living his really super upper class lifestyle. To be clear, Bassanio is not poor. He's very much upper class. He's just, living a bit too beyond his means. Antonio is a wealthy merchant. He's a shipman. He brings stuff in, he sells it, he makes a bomb. Hence the Merchant of Venice. Antonio is generally pretty wealthy. He's a businessman, as I said. He's a successful businessman. Bassanio comes to him and says, hey, I want to win this lady. I need to flex my wealth. Can you give me some money? I normally borrow money from you. I pay it back. I can, you normally help me out, right? And he goes, my vessels are all at sea. I do not have no cash. I do not have no cash. I do not have any cash. I guess you're going to have to get a loan. I will be your guarantor. I.e., if for whatever reason, you can't pay the money back, I will step in and pay it. It's a traditional, best buddies helping each other out thing. The problem is the loaner that they go to is a bit controversial in Venice. He's not well liked, our Shylock. And especially Shylock does not like Antonio. Shylock does not like Antonio. Antonio is discriminatory towards Shylock, which is a really interesting characterization that we'll get to. And Shylock is, this is where we get to this kind of characterization of Shylock. He holds a bit of a grudge, which fair enough, he's been discriminated against his whole life, especially by people like Antonio, and he's really not a big fan. So Shylock, instead of charging his usual interest, which is quite controversial, people don't like Shylock charging interest on his loans, which begs the question of how do you expect to do business? That's how interest works. Like, banks aren't giving out money to free, but that is a contextual thing, right? In Elizabethan England, it was seen immoral to be like asking for extra when it's just a little bargaining. It was totally normal for Shylock, and fair enough, that's how banking works. But that's quite a controversial choice he's making. People don't like him for it. So Shylock went, well, I won't charge you interest this time. I'm a good man. However, he decides to really test Antonio. He says, if you don't pay me this money back by a date I have specified, I will take some interest. I will take a pound of your flesh. Which is pretty extreme. And Antonio's going, okay, that's not going to happen. I'm going to get my money back on time. My ships are going to come in. Even worst case scenario, Bassanio's going to have his money and he's a girl. Like, we're all good. You're a bit insane, man, but that's fine. Unfortunately, all does not go to plan, as it would not in a Shakespeare play. What happens is two things. Bassanio does woo Portia. He picks lead. The lead casket with that riddle about, he will give all he has, basically. And Portia is instantly enamored with Bassanio and is instantly loyal to him. Predominantly because, he got the riddle, he seems like a good guy, all that kind of stuff. However, that money comes a bit late. Shylock's deadline has passed. Antonio's ships have been reported that they've been lost. Problematic. He has no money. Bassanio's money is too late. Shylock doesn't take kindly to them not agreeing to the terms of the contract. Shylock is extra mad because his daughter Jessica's the other subplot going on here, has run away. She's sick of her grumpy old dad. She's sick of the discrimination she faces in the town. So they respond to discrimination in two very different ways here. And she goes, Lorenzo, I love you. I'm becoming a Christian and I'm running away and also stealing all of my dad's money. And Shylock has a fair amount of money. She also does things like pawn some goods off, which extra hurt Shylock. So he is mad. He's particularly mad at Christians, Antonio being an excellent representation of one. Shylock wants revenge. He's going to stick to the terms of his contract that he set out and Antonio agreed to. Then we move into a bit of a court scene. So we have a new act. We change pace quite suddenly. You'd think in most Shakespeare texts it would end in some way with Shylock being killed and Antonio being happy. But we actually have a little detour to take first, in which there's a court scene where Bassanio says, hey, I've got your money. I'll pay you back threefold. Just don't take my friend's blood and flesh. And Shylock refuses to take it. So he keeps refusing. And Portia, effectively, what happens is Portia and her lady-in-waiting, disguised as lawyers, have kind of infiltrated the courtroom as a legal doctor. And she says, well, the interpretation of this contract is pretty clear. You have a right for your pound of flesh. You both agreed to it, But, you should be merciful. Just give, he's offering the money, just take it. At this point, Shakespeare is kind of saying Shylock's not a great guy. It's pretty not great to be demanding payment in the form of flesh. However, obviously, you did agree to this, and Shylock is just interpreting the contract. He hasn't turned into full-blown evilness just yet. Once Portia gives him the opportunity to still choose mercy, and he still refuses, Shylock loses the upper hand in both the eyes of the audience and within the scene. So Portia will interpret the contract very strictly. She says, well, okay then, but you have specified exactly 1 pound of flesh, no blood, no viscera, etc. So if you spill any blood, well, that breaks the terms of the contract. It would have to be, torn up. And, well, if you are just a gram under or just a gram more, you'll also have broken the terms of the contract. Also, by the way, if you do any of this and want to take a chance, you'll be down for the attempted murder of a Venetian, basically. So she still gives him a chance. She's like, you can do it. You can cut the flesh off. But, you know, if you don't do either... Shylock cannot do that, obviously. He knows that the jig is up, basically. The decision is then made that Shylock has to effectively give up all his property. That is done by splitting it between Antonio and the state. The state goes, that's fine, we can remit that, that's all good. That's the, you know, charge for attempted murder. But Portia says, hang on. The state can't remit, you know, Antonio's owage. So if he wants to take that money, he is more than welcome to. And Antonio takes most of Shylock's money in lieu of, basically, I'll have control of it, and when you die, it comes to me. Shylock is basically has to agree to that now. As he says, I'm content. He's obviously not content. It's not ideal in any way, shape, or form. But he has to go through with it. And at the end, Shylock was then forced to convert to Christianity. It really sucks for Shylock. It's a bad ending for him. Everyone else is really happy though. So there's a subplot where Portia, as payment for her services, took Bassanio's wedding ring, even though she had made Bassanio promise that he'd never give it away. She's kind of mad at him for a bit and then reveals, like, I have the ring. I was the lawyer. Which is kind of a bit of a weird one, but that's, again, that symbolic of loyalty and riches before, you know, what the value of riches are. That's kind of going on in the background, but we basically get to the end. Shylock's pretty miserable, but everyone else is having a good time. The oversimplified plot summary is basically Shylock has screwed around and he's found out deeply. He didn't have to. He could have, as I said, chosen mercy, but as his antics got more intense, he reached a level of greater consequences, basically. So basically the ultimate warning against messing around and finding out, as it said. Moving on to some character analysis now. I have listed a bunch of characters. There are some characters that you could probably still discuss, but these 6 are the ones we'll discuss today. Some are more important than others, as I mentioned. Others are a bit minor. They may not make up a lot of your analysis. Obviously, someone like Shylock is going to feature quite heavily in a lot of your analysis, whereas, you know, Nerissa isn't really that important, but she's still a good character to discuss in the context of this lecture. So, Shylock, oh, hang on everyone, sorry. Oh, my slides have gotten mixed up. Everyone, wait just 1 second. Hang on, everyone. Okay, my screen should be black. That's not correct. And is very weird. Sorry, everyone, that's so weird. Give me 2 seconds, everyone. I had to swap computers halfway through. My laptop needed to be taken to the Apple store. So let's have a look at this. Better. Okay, slight interlude. Go grab a glass of water. I found the right one. Don't stress, everyone. Yeah, I was making the slides on my iPad, in short, which was not the most conducive to good work, to be honest. It was a bit difficult. But, you know, we manage. No, there we go. So, anyway, I saved 2 copies down, thank goodness. Otherwise, that would have been highly problematic for my mental health. Okay, let's turn the camera and the screen back on. Hello again. And let's jump back into 6 characters that we're going to discuss. Not big a stress. Hopefully you guys have the right slides uploaded. I'm sure they should be. If they're not, please let me know and we'll get the real ones, the correct ones uploaded as well. So, Shylock, our primary character, he's our main character, right? But he isn't really our protagonist in a good sense. He's not our main character in a positive sense. He's kind of the villain. But he's, not. He's very, very complicated and interesting. He's probably one of Shakespeare's most complicated characters, I would say. Someone like Iago is one of Shakespeare's most interesting or fun, but he's also just straight up evil, right? Shylock is a morally kind of ambiguous character, in that we've also have an interpretation of him that is very clearly based on our own context as readers. So, is he doing anything wrong? Is he kind of just taking what he's owed and to an extent has been treated horribly and just, okay, thank you, the slides are the old version. Okay, for those of you looking at the slides presently, I think the wrong slides are uploaded, Bella. Thank you very, very much. For those of you, so you've got Crucible slides uploaded, my sincerest apologies. We will get them emailed out after lectures. I don't think I can upload them at the moment just because the page has gone live. I will ask my tech wizard, Alec, to see if that can be done. If not, we will get them emailed out as soon as this week is finished. I'm very sorry for that. Don't make PowerPoints on an iPad, I guess. An old iPad. It's not like up fancy. It's like a Generation 6, okay? But yeah, okay, thank you for letting me know. I really appreciate it. And I'm very, very, very sorry for that. That's not great for you guys. But follow along with me. Hopefully it should be straightforward to follow. The main difference is obviously the character. The themes are obviously different as well, but themes are themes, so don't stress. And I'll be doing a lot of the talking anyway, so hopefully it'll be okay. So, as I was saying, Shylock is a very interesting character. So we have a character that is purely based on, not purely, but very much our interpretation depends on how we perceive him and what our context allows him to do. So in a modern day, we might have a more deep opinion about, he didn't do a lot wrong, like he was wronged. He was just, he was a bit barbaric, but he's not the villain. 100, 200 years ago, everyone would be going, he's, a horrific character, basically. That also is dependent on how, history has changed over time. Obviously, anti-Semitism is still very much a thing, but maybe not as ingrained in society at such a vitriolic level as it was hundreds of years ago. Or I shouldn't say hundreds of years ago, maybe, 100 years ago even. Shylock is being shown to be complicated because his treatment is on display. Shakespeare, even though he is obviously not necessarily being the most progressive in his portrayal at times from our perspective, he still highlights he's a human. He's isolated, he's discriminated against, he's humiliated in front of his peers. Even at the end of the text, he doesn't just loses his money, he's embarrassed by everyone. The treatment of him is on full display. People in the audience had to witness someone being abused by other people that looked and sounded like them. Shylock's downfall, if you want to consider his, say, hubris, which I know is more like a technical term referring to a character, but, let's use it here as well because I think it works. He's not quite a hero, but, he's a martyr, I should say, sorry. His hamartia is his desperate need for revenge. He wants to right all the wrongs he's experienced, and everything he's suffered. And more importantly, almost he wants to have power over his oppressors. He wants to have some type of justice. You have treated me badly. I'm going to put that back onto you, basically. He is, as I said, he's humiliated. He's been embarrassed. He loses everything. But as I mentioned, it's very clear that Shakespeare is willing to let an acceptance of that go on to a point. Shakespeare is willing to go, he's a human, he's responding to this way in a relatively normal way, you know, like he's not doing it, he is doing it to get bad means, but if you wrong us, shall we not revenge is the key line, right? That monologue is meant to make us go, yeah, fair enough. If I was treated this badly, I would also do that. Shakespeare's key argument, though, which is at the crux of a lot of his texts and is also antithetical to the context of the time. In Elizabethan England, if you were wronged, you were allowed to respond to that publicly. You weren't meant to show mercy, forgiveness. You're meant to, mercy maybe, forgiveness not so much. It's totally normal to go, well, actually, I'm going to respond to this properly. So in Shylock choosing revenge, or to get what he's properly owed, isn't necessarily against our context or the Elizabethan context, but Shakespeare is clearly saying Shylock took it too far. If he had shown mercy, he would have been, I guess, a warning tale of the dangers of discrimination, but everything can be overcome in the end. Instead, Shylock is an example of how far you can be pushed, basically. So the very clear message is, this type of mercy over this Christian humanism as it was known, which is another contextual thing. Antonio is also very interesting in that he is almost a mirror to Shylock, in that they are both unhappy and feel like they're outsiders. Antonio, despite having money, we have this moment that, obviously, he doesn't have money for a bit. But he's wealthy, he seems to be living a good life. Yet, he is deeply, deeply unhappy. He's mournful and solemn all the time. Despite the fact he's loyal, he helps his friends, he gets what he wants to in the end, he doesn't seem to care. He acts consistently as if he has nothing to lose, even though he does have a fair bit to lose. He goes to do similar behaviors again. He doesn't really care. He wants to take risks. And yet, he is our titular character. Nothing really happens to him by the end of the play. Nothing goes, for him, there are no consequences, right? He is discriminatory. He loses money. He gets his money back. He may almost has a consequence happen, but it doesn't. And then it ends. Nothing really happens to Antonio. He doesn't have a relationship. So we have kind of 2 points here for what we have 2 points here for kind of what oh god, I forgot my line of thought. For what Shakespeare is trying to say here. Sorry. We have kind of 2 points in terms of what is being communicated here. Antonio obviously takes a lot of risks. He offers heaps of money, which contextually isn't too inaccurate. Sometimes, it was a great show of generosity. He takes lots of risks, right? He will enter into deals and stuff like that. Is Shakespeare saying that his unhappiness is as a result of his lack of connections and the importance of relationships? Or is Shakespeare trying to communicate a distaste for the fact that Antonio is constantly pushing the boundaries of the social environments? They're both valid interpretations. In terms of your context, in terms of that relationship point, that mirrors quite nicely with Shylock, and we'll get to that in the second part of the lecture. But obviously Antonio is quite socially transgressive. Partially because he has no relationships, partially because he behaves quite brashly. So, question to yourself, where is Shakespeare trying to send you? It could be both. He could be trying to prove both points. Which one works for you better? As I mentioned, he's kind of our titular protagonist, although someone has rightfully kind of asked, is the Merchant of Venice Shylock or Antonio? And we'll discuss that in a bit. Let's call him our titular character for the moment. he is still not seen as an angel, right? He is shown to be fiercely discriminatory towards Shylock and treats him very poorly. And in that way, it's twofold. Without Antonio, the play doesn't transpire. One, without his willing to risk his life for Bassanio, and two, without his previous poor treatment of Shylock. Without either of those events, the play can't transpire. If he is generous towards Bassanio but has always treated Shylock politely, Shylock's not going to be like, I'm actually going to kill you if you don't give me my money back. Even if he'd been awful to Shylock but said to Bassanio, no, you're only your own king, it still wouldn't have transpired. So Antonio has to do two things to set the play in motion. Bassanio is very much a significant character. Without him, he's kind of the catalyst. His inability to manage his money is what enables him to need to take out a loan, despite the fact he shouldn't. He is absurdly reckless, right? He just he's doing things in order to secure a better future for himself. However, when you think about it, he actually does very little. He's kind of there, he goes to Portia, picks the right cast, and then heads back to Venice for the court scene. He himself doesn't actually engage and put himself at risk a lot. He is not the one that's going to answer to the money. He obviously does get married, but he just has to play the game, right? He's not stealing money. He's kind of doesn't do a lot, which is very interesting to think about how significant we are. A bit of a commentary on, I guess, how our actions have consequences in such a basic way. As I said, because his recklessness is the catalyst of the play, despite being very wealthy, it's almost like Shakespeare is again communicating that wealth or an accumulation of wealth may not be the positive. The flip side of that being, in terms of wealth being positive, negative, is that Bassanio, in shrugging off his wealth, picking the lead casket over the gold or the silver, shrugs off his wealth. He says, no, we don't need gold. I'm going to pick with the lead. And that's how he kind of wins his prize, which solves our play. So Shakespeare, I think, is making a pretty clear point there that wealth is not necessarily a positive. And in fact, the lack of wealth may bring us more positives than negatives, than the alternate. Lorenzo and Jessica are obviously our pair. They are both shown to be relatively kind. They, however, don't maybe understand the impact they have on the events outside of them as two individuals. Lorenzo is a source for a lot of drama. Obviously, if not for his relationship with Jessica, she doesn't rob Shylock and flee from him. But he kind of is just there. He's a bit almost like an inverse damsel in distress type character. Normally you see the woman that's just kind of goes along with things. The man, maybe in these circumstances, are the one getting money and getting us out. Whereas it's flipped here. He's very much a passive character. Jessica, on the other hand, is not passive at all. She is eager to shed her relationship with her father. She's eager to convert. She is eager to move away from the discrimination she has faced. So she's very uncomfortable because she is not aggressively mean, but she speaks very, very, very negatively about her father and her life. Yet, as modern readers, we can probably go, fair, maybe fair. Her kind of, as I said before a bit, that her response to discrimination is a bit different to Shylock. But they're both examples of what happens when you're treated. It doesn't have to be discrimination, just in general treated poorly. So she separates herself from her identity. Shylock kind of digs down and becomes more ingrained in it. She is ultimately a uncomfortable character as well for Shakespeare's time. You had to be committed to your family, especially your father as a woman. So to that extent, she's a very transgressive character. She is relatively independent. She chooses to escape her marginalization. She wants to find love above all. She marries out of her class. She is ultimately is not punished as well for it, right? So she does all these socially not okay things, but doesn't really face any consequences. To an extent, for women in this period, especially our women groundlings who are watching, and although seeing a man in a dress play Jessica, watching and seeing, hey, I could do that. There, obviously, maybe I'm not going to insult my father and steal from him, but I could do this. Yeah, so she is to an extent a bit aspirational. Portia and Nerissa are kind of our other little pair. They are a bit complex as well in that they're very interesting characters for the time period they were created in. So Portia is a stereotype, but also very revolutionary. She is shown to be rich and a bit, maybe a bit in that regard. So she is introduced basically by having her make fun of these suitors that are trying to woo her, even though the suitors seem like relatively fine dudes. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with them, but she'll make fun of them and degrade them. So she's seen as just a bit overly privileged and unpleasant as a result. However, she's also very interesting in that she doesn't necessarily she does want wealth, obviously, but she also wants intelligence and emotional compatibility while still understanding that she wants to follow her father's wishes. She is incredibly loyal, which is demonstrated by Nerissa, who is not just a typical servant. Portia doesn't just want someone to follow her around and do stuff. She wants someone, that she can converse with. And she's instantly loyal to Bassanio. So she does it. As soon as Bassanio tells her his woes, she goes, okay, well, I'm going to help somehow. Another revolutionary thing, it is a woman in this case that saves the day. Saves the day, maybe not from Shylock's perspective. But it is a woman that saves our main character, Antonio. She steps in with her intelligence and does it, which is a really incredible thing. Obviously, also something humorous in a male actor dressing as Portia, dressing as a lawyer, to just make sure it's not too out there for a woman saving the day. As I said, Nerissa reflects very kindly on Portia. She's very intelligent. She's less judgmental than Portia, which potentially reflects her lower class, but she's still quite impressive. She doesn't save the day, but she supports Portia in her saving of the day. And our hero here is not just a woman, but a lower class woman, a servant. She, to be straight up there, is really revolutionary in terms of displaying and highlighting, the abilities, the intelligence, the kindness across all classes on Shakespeare's front here. While contrasting the upper class, i.e. Antonio, discrimination. Okay, so moving on to block 2 now, which is more of our analytical block. So we'll go into the key themes of the text, some of which I've already kind of alluded to, and then a little bit about some of the language features and form. So let's jump straight back in. As I said at the very start of the lecture, we're going over 6 key themes today. That should, like in an ideal world, you'll have probably 3 body paragraphs, maybe 4 if you're a bit speedy, but generally 3 body paragraphs. So this gives you, if you prepare for all of these, which you don't have to, you might prefer a different theme, this will allow you to kind of have some and have a bunch more spare. So let's start with love, which is arguably one of the more important themes. They're all pretty important, but it's love and relationships are very, very high up there. So the text has no driving force without relationships. Obviously, greed and wealth are also key, because without them, that's not the, the drama of the text, not quite good, isn't going to occur. But relationships is what starts the text. So think about not just romantic love, but also platonic love. Without the platonic love, the relationship between Antonio and Bassanio, I always say Bassanio. Swap the letters around. Without the platonic love between Antonio and Bassanio, the text itself does not start, because there is no money exchanged. Similarly, without Portia and Nerissa's relationship, we don't really see a positive conclusion, also because of Portia and Bassanio's relationship. So the key relationships here are the driving force, but also the lack of relationships are quite important. Antonio and Bassanio. You're right. Without Shylock doesn't have any relationships, right? Without any kind of person to care about, even his failure to really care, not care in an overt way about Jessica, in a way that Jessica feels is proper. He doesn't have a community. He suffers in this isolation, which, as I put up, is a theme we're going to discuss in a second, but you could probably merge those themes, right? Relationships and isolation could be your kind of theme. The kind of suggestion that Shakespeare puts out there is, if Shylock had stronger relationships, would he be the way he was portrayed? Like, would he have ended up such a kind of bitter character? And it's probably likely he wouldn't have ended the way he was. The fact that he also loses his relationship with Jessica, the fact he is so distraught by it, although obviously in the scene he doesn't just say, my daughter, he adds, my daughter fled with a Christian taking my money. So his genuineness is up for debate. But he's very clear about the devastation that his daughter betraying him brings him. His last kind of pillar to his life that isn't him, which we obviously see escalate into that main conflict, the fact that Shylock needs revenge. So even if Jessica hadn't run away, which is connected to a more positive relationship, the main issue of the text probably doesn't happen. So relationships are absolutely key to this text. The other key, and I think the kind of main two-ish themes, I would say, or let's lump them, love and relationships, wealth and greed, I think are the two kind of really major aspects of the text. Obviously, we have discrimination. I'd probably have to. It's good to write a paragraph on discrimination because, it's obviously highly, highly prominent. But wealth and greed is another key theme that kind of undercuts the whole play. So throughout Merchant, Shakespeare really highlights that wealth can bring you immense comfort and change your life, as demonstrated by Jessica being able to move up in the social structure, but also demonstrated by what Bassanio and Portia are able to gain because of that. So it does do good things. Wealth isn't, he's not saying, it's horrific. Shakespeare's not a communist, right? He's not straight up decrying a need for collectivization or whatever. But he is very critical about the negatives that immense wealth can bring you. Demonstrated by Shylock, obviously. His greed is one of the inciting issues. And as a result, it causes him absolute ruin. Antonio's kind of wealth, being able to be a guarantor for a loan and then losing that money, could have also caused him immense ruin. Obviously, it doesn't end that badly for him, but for a moment there, it looks pretty bleak. And other examples also follow. We are shown that there is a clear double-edged sword here to wealth. Clearly, Shakespeare is warning us against that massive accumulation of wealth, maybe not, but letting those selfish interests get the better of us. So again, go back to the fact that Bassanio chooses the least wealthy casket, and that is what gives him, his goal, his a positive outcome, but also the text's positive outcome. Greed as well is obviously key. You can't really talk about wealth in this case without greed. That it is not just the wealth that obviously drives these characters to ruin, because at the end of the text, a lot of the wealthy characters remain wealthy. And other than really Shylock, there aren't a whole heap of consequences functionally. Maybe there's moral consequences, people kind of got a little scare, but on the whole, it's not exactly devastating for anyone other than Shylock. So there is a little caveat there. So does greed work out for some in the end? Is Shakespeare putting a limit on greed? So as we demonstrated, had Shylock offered mercy, his greed wouldn't have been too great. So maybe it's more about revenge and less about greed. But greed and wealth, and that, I guess, feeling like you're owed something as a result, the entitlement which comes to revenge, is quite a clear issue in this play. So that's one of those things that you should discuss and have in your back of your head and create an opinion about. So obviously here I've kind of gone through different things. I've said wealth's pretty good for some, but actually it's horrific and can ruin you, and greed is horrible, but also it works out okay. So obviously it's very multifaceted here. You want to have a think about, what do I believe? What do I think is represented in the play? Justice and mercy, very closely related to revenge. And as you can kind of see, I haven't necessarily put up revenge as an individual theme. The reason for that is I think it runs kind of the whole way through. You can have a paragraph on revenge, obviously, but it is a prominent theme that doesn't necessarily, I guess you swap out greed a bit, revenge and wealth or something. It often you would discuss it for every single point. So you don't necessarily need to make it a paragraph. You could kind of make it an underlying theme throughout the whole text. Justice and mercy are very complicated issues. And I know that seems like a silly thing to say, which, this is an English lecture, not a legal studies lecture. But it is worthwhile to discuss in the face of this play. Because often justice and mercy don't align. And this will get a little bit philosophical, but regardless, is a good one to consider. So in the case of the play, whether you believe the outcome is just or merciful for that matchup, what angel are you looking for? What angle? That's a bit of a spelling mistake. Thanks, iPad, for catching that. Whether you believe it depends on your perception of the characters and their actions. So do you think Shylock should have to return mercy, even though he himself has never experienced it, and potentially even after the events of the play never will experience it? Why should he have to be merciful in response? Would technically justness be adhering to the terms of the contract? Shylock entered a legal contract, Antonio agreed to it. Why should he get to turn around and dismiss that? We obviously know it's because it's the right thing to do, but it is a bit more of a complicated issue, right? Or you want to think of it like it's a bit more of a complicated issue. So the Duke himself also seems to define the law as he wishes. So he kind of vibes along and says, well, the state can get rid of that, or maybe we'll do this, rather than actually following the facts, which is probably not the correct conceptualization of justice and in a court, right? The reason for this complicated outcome, and the fact that it can kind of feel a bit disappointing as outcomes go, because realistically, Antonio isn't a good person here, right? He receives zero consequences for his actions. Even Bassanio doesn't really see any consequences either. Shylock, on the other hand, loses everything. And the characters revel in that, despite the fact that we've been shown throughout the play that Shylock is very mistreated. If we wrong us, will we not revenge? So the outcome can feel a little bit one-sided. And that's because of the complexity of these characters. So we have, even amongst the Shakespeare pantheon, we have really interesting characters. Shylock is not just evil for the sake of being evil, as I said. He has, to an extent, a reason to behave the way he does. And really his crime in the first place, ignoring the whole flesh bit, is charging interest on loans, which from our modern perspective is obviously pretty like, yeah, sure, that's what happens. And our protagonist, Antonio, as I've said, is not a saint. He is one of the reasons this play progresses the way it does, because he treated Shylock poorly. So obviously, while we know ultimately the correct answer is that Shylock should have shown mercy at the point, he was still going to come out ahead and just say, okay, I'll take the money, have your life, basically. We can still question how we look at the text and how our interpretations may differ depending on the angle we're looking at. We also have this issue of race and religion and prejudice. So I've split prejudice up into two, race and religion as one and gender as another. Gender may not necessarily be a paragraph, but I think it's something worthwhile to discuss, although I have seen plenty of paragraphs done before with it and it looks great. For race and religion, prejudice is obviously key, right? Without Shylock being discriminated against, he doesn't do what he does. As you can see, there are a lot of connecting threads in this text. If something doesn't happen, something else doesn't happen. And while this is the case for a lot of Shakespeare plays, it is very, very tightly strung. Almost like, I was going to say, it's like a big spider web, and if you cut one thread, it doesn't, if you cut one thread, the whole thing collapses. It's probably more like the Swiss cheese model of like things going wrong, where your goal is to have as many, many layers. Heaps of things have had to have gone wrong to get to this point, right? Every theme is very, very closely connected. So in this case, Shakespeare is very much criticizing the discrimination of his day, which is a very radical thing for him to do. He's plainly saying, if you are prejudicial against people, bad things are going to happen. And it's not necessarily going to be your fault if it happens, but also kind of will be. So in the case of these consequences of prejudice, Shylock obviously is entirely committed to revenge as a result and almost commits basically murder. For Jessica, she commits something just as heinous for this era, which is abandoning all her connections and family and effectively committing one of the worst sins in Elizabethan England, which is to kind of cut ties with your father, particularly. It's a big deal. They both do incredibly divisive things for this era, and the only reason they do that is because of those effects of discrimination. And we see Shakespeare, as I've said, saying that discrimination is rife and it is infecting all aspects of society. So we have that demonstration. We have Antonio, who's our protagonist. He's meant to be the good guy, behave very poorly. And yet Shakespeare still says there is a point in which we can no longer use that as an excuse. We're meant to be humans. Even though Shylock is a bad person, you need to treat him with humanity. Even though Shylock, you've been wronged, you still need to act with that humanity. So the key monologue, as I've kind of mentioned a few times, is that have nodded you eyes, have nodded you, etc., etc. If you prick us, do we not bleed? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? It is a very compelling speech. And imagine you watching it, right? You're on the ground or maybe in the stands if you've got a little bit bougie, and there is someone on stage who looks like the guy down the corner that you're pretty nasty to, maybe not quite down the corner, but telling you, I will wrong you, and then going through and doing that if you do not start to treat me better, and I will be justified because we are the same. It's a very powerful speech, especially given the context, and Shakespeare is really emphasizing the humanity despite divisions of race and religion. As we discussed at the beginning, Shakespeare is obviously still engaging in a bit of prejudice himself. He's not, exactly kind to Shylock in his portrayal. He's very much portrayed as the evil Jew stereotype. But for this era, something like this was a pretty big deal. And it's not the first time Shakespeare's obviously done something this big. We also have gender as a... Ooh, my voice is going a bit. We also have gender as a key issue, again linking into paragraphs. As I mentioned, it may not become a paragraph in an essay. You only kind of have 3 paragraphs, so you might deal with something more important, though, as I said, I have seen many a gender paragraph and they look really good. But it's a really interesting point to consider, and maybe you've had a bit of a debate in class about it. Gender in this text is done really interestingly. Normally, Shakespeare's female characters are a bit damsel in distress. You have a level of they can be a bit independent. The independence is generally derived from some type of distinction from the norm. So in the case of, say, The Tempest, we have Miranda grows up outside of any kind of nobility, so she's a normal person. Normal. She behaves better, basically. Portia is outside the norm, one, because from Shakespeare's perspective, she's in Venice. Oh, what an exotic land. She's also wealthy and has that wealth largely independently. So she is a woman that has been left that wealth. So she has power, basically, in herself, though she still respects her father's wishes. She is powerful, she owns her kind of future to an extent, and then she saves the day, basically. Jessica, as well, is a bit separate from the norm because she comes from that discrimination. And while doing things that may not necessarily be entirely agreeable, especially within the context, she escapes these confines and goes and does her own thing, and it's pretty cool. So, we have gendered characters that are, to an extent, more important than the guys. Without Jessica, Shylock doesn't feel the need to get proper revenge. Without Portia, we don't have an ending or a beginning. They play a highly active role. As I said, they're not passive. They are making decisions and doing things. Yet, they're also powerful women doing those things. And Portia coming in, saving the day with her intelligence, dressed as a man, which is also an interesting commentary. Obviously, she couldn't have done it. Lawyers can't be women, obviously. She had to, but it's also an interesting choice from Shakespeare. She didn't walk in and try and, settle the score just by talking. She had to do it as a man because that's how she was going to be respected. So it's an interesting point for Shakespeare. Okay, our final theme of today. Oh, God, that meme got absolutely squashed in processing. Sorry for the 2 pixels there. Isolation is obviously a pretty key issue. Ironically, as I kind of mentioned when talking about the relationship theme, Antonio and Shylock are almost a mirror. They've taken a path of isolation, although to an extent Shylock hasn't really chosen it. It's due to his circumstances. Antonio has more made a choice there. They have, ironically, very, very similar. This is a play that is defined by relationships, and yet we have our kind of 2 protagonists-ish have the most melancholy. And they end up continuing to be isolated throughout the text, even though Antonio has a happy ending. Shylock is alone, neglected. Antonio should be happy, but really he's just chilling with his melancholy. And they kind of mirror each other in that regard. They are pushed together. Antonio due to his relationship, Shylock due to his lack of relationships, but Shylock then due to his relationship with Jessica. They are a mirror in that sense. Shakespeare loves a good mirror. He loves having characters that are kind of similar, but a bit different depending on the circumstances. So he's clearly, as we said with the relationship theme, making a commentary on the importance of connections and relationships, but he's also very clearly highlighting the different things. So Antonio has some relationships. He's obviously more successful. He has a better relationship with society, though he's less isolated within society, which may be seen as the difference there. So a really interesting thing to consider the similarities between Antonio and Shylock as the play progresses. So just give me 2 minutes to take a breath, drink some water, and make sure my throat's not going to explode. Okay, let's jump back into it. Some language features and form. Now, can I go back to the isolation slide quickly, Peters? I sure can. Sorry, I didn't see that. My phone disconnected. So, I'm going to leave it on the isolation side for just a tiny bit. And then I'll still talk, though, I guess is the point. Does it say 4 still? Hang on. Why am I not on my Wi-Fi? That's bizarre. Cool. So, why are language form and features so important? Well, obviously they provide the evidence you need in English. You can't make a point without that evidence. But why does it particularly matter for Shakespeare? The answer is because Shakespeare is a visual text. Now, if you can, go try and find, not the movie version, although I'm sure there is a movie version, some type of a performance of The Merchant of Venice. There will be one on YouTube. If there's not one, that you can go see at like a local theatre somewhere. And when I say local theatre, obviously that's not a thing, but like Sydney Theatre Company, Shakespeare, whoever does it. None of them I think are doing it, so a YouTube version is probably the best idea. That allows you to actually visually see it. Shakespeare was not designed to be read, it's designed to be performed. At the very least, spoken out loud, which I'm sure is really annoying when you're in English. You just want the teacher to read it and go through it and tell us what to write, and she keeps picking people to play characters, and it's really annoying. I get it. No, your teacher has a point, though. It is the best way to kind of, one, understand it without getting bogged down in, old English language, but also by being able to see visually and understand what's happening rather than just reading it. That's especially important to note when you consider the audience of the time, who the text was designed for in terms of causing the biggest impact to, would have seen it. They're not picking up like the latest copy of Shakespeare and flicking down and reading it, because a lot of them couldn't read. They couldn't do that. So it had to be performed. I'm just flicking off the isolation side. Please yell at me again if you want me to go back. So as a result, the construction from a visual perspective and the things that are going on in the play are really important. How it's presented. When you write about Shakespeare, you are absolutely allowed to talk about like metaphors or something like that, because that's fine. And of course, you'll chuck in the classic Shakespeare stuff like a monologue, because of course you're going to. But you need to, and this is really key, and it goes for any other non-prose text. If you're doing another play at a point, that a non-prose text you're doing, you have to talk about the structure, stage directions, the acts, symbolism, things like that, big form ideas. Because for something like Shakespeare, The Crucible, which if you're in New South Wales, you're obviously not doing, if you're studying this, even poems, you want to talk about the structure, not just the words. You're seeing it as a whole. And with a play, that's extra important because it is a visual performance text rather than just a read it text, in the same way that even poetry is. So the first one I'd like to discuss is prose and verse. And this is just to spice up your regular text analysis. When you're talking about an alliteration, or you're talking about, talking about alliteration, or talking about, a monologue, even a soliloquy, whatever, they're all really valid. You can still use them. But to spice it up a bit, you should be able to interpret it within the confines of the text itself. So it's not just a soliloquy. It's a prose soliloquy or a verse soliloquy. So the difference between these two being verse is all about the structure. So that's when you get into iambic pentameter. It has a rhythm. It can rhyme sometimes. It's almost song-like. It is meant to mimic natural speech in the same way an orator mimics natural speech. So when you listen to someone talk and give a speech, they're not talking normally. They're carrying a weight with them. In a task I did extension to English for a good chunk of the year. And in some of the poems I wrote, it was the voice of a leader kind of speaking. And it was really fun within the poem trying to capture the tone using the structure. So it had something like 8 beats per line, kind of like a military march. And it would often, there would be a beat that's a space or something. I don't know. It was really fun to kind of get into the zone. As you can see, I'm a bit of a nerd. That's what verse does. It allows to have that kind of passion, but it is refined. Generally, upper class characters will speak in verse, lower class characters are more likely to speak in prose, which is, as the name suggests, just plain writing. It doesn't necessarily have the structure of verse. Characters that maybe change at points are really essential. So go through and actually consider, is this prose or verse? Especially for moments that are high pressure. So important speeches where the character can no longer contain themselves to adhere to, the proper way of talking may change from normal verse into prose. And I guess vice versa if a lower class character is trying to address a more wealthy contingent. So prose and verse isn't, it's not necessarily like the most fun type of analysis, because it might feel a bit, not basic, but for you guys it might just feel boring talking about like the actual structure of the words. Iambic pentameter is like the classic Shakespeare thing people talk about, but you kind of go, why would I talk about it? Like, yeah, it sounds like a rhythm, it sounds like a heartbeat, cool. Being able to pair it with something else will really make your answer pop. So as I said, a soliloquy done in something. The soliloquy, blah, 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 exposes, etc. By having it presented in prose rather than the character's usual verse, Shakespeare is also highlighting the passion or whatever. So it's a good little analysis to have in the back of your head, especially when you might be searching for something. Maybe you've got a paragraph, you've already done 2 soliloquies, you can't have another one. You need something else. This gives that variety. The next one we have is stage direction and structure. So structure referring to, say, the acts of the play. Merchant has really varying act structures. We have really short acts. We have really long acts. We obviously have the court scene making up quite a different change. We move from a very person-centered drama to something that is still person-centered, but is a bit different. We mark a bit of a change there. It's something that Shakespeare plays don't normally do. So the structure refers to those kinds of acts. Obviously, it's not the same as the usual 5-act structure for like a hero text, because we don't really have a hero in this play, do we? Stage directions being a key aspect to include, again, from a form perspective. Stage directions and setting and stuff like that. Obviously, that being the little text that Shakespeare includes outside the actual content of the play. The reason why that's essential is because that is what the actors had to read before performing. So they direct, obviously directions, they direct what's going on. They say, this is the tone that Shylock should be taking. This is how Antonio is feeling. This is what's going on. This is the setting we're in. So again, to incorporate that importance of the visual production, it's super important. Again, it's one of the things you conclude that still allows you to have a good exploration. It's not a bad technique, but it is a bit different and a little bit more interesting. And of course goes to the form of the text being a play. Symbolism here, there's a lot of symbolism in this text. So we kind of have the rings, or rings in general, as a symbol of loyalty. So we obviously have towards the end, Portia promises, Portia kind of says, please, please don't ever give away this ring under any circumstances. But then they do. Bassanio gives away his ring because he's convinced that has to be the payment, right? Which is, again, an interesting thing about not letting wealth get to you. But it's an important symbolism about that bond that, initially Portia scolds him and then they kind of move on. Shylock's wife's ring is also a key moment. We see Jessica kind of sell it for meaningless kind of things. Shylock is furious about that, and as he says, it was worth, so much more basically sentimental value than anything you could have ever have gotten for it to be sold. So again, that symbol of loyalty, of relationships, and how that can kind of be given away. We also have the symbolism of Venice as a concept, right? So the play is, and we discussed this at the beginning with that context element. Venice is a symbol in this play. It's almost its own character, not only because of what it represents, of that faraway land that's, you know, a realm of possibility, but also because it is one of the essential aspects of the text. Like, we have to have the merchants, so Venice is very diverse, those types of things. So Venice is also a bit symbolic in that manner. In terms of, as that question kind of asked, is Shylock or Antonio the merchant of Venice, or are they both? That's also a bit of the symbolism there. As we kind of discussed, Antonio and Shylock are almost like a mirror. They're both very similar. So to an extent, I think Shakespeare's intention was that Antonio is the merchant of Venice, but he didn't just give it a name. He didn't call it Shylock. He didn't call it Antonio. If he called it Shylock or Antonio, it'd be a bit of a suggestion that one of them would die, maybe. So he doesn't. He keeps it ambiguous in that way, kind of refers to them, and, you know, he keeps that kind of level of who is it. I mean, I went through, until I was kind of researching for this lecture, I'd always thought the merchant of Venice was Shylock. He was the titular character. And I think I even said it, like, I had 2 PT students that were both doing Merchant of Venice, and I think I probably said that to them, and neither of them kind of looked twice at me. Yeah, so to the person who just asked, the downloadable slides are for the Crucible. Yes, so they're the wrong slides. I'm very, very sorry. We're going to email them out after, very soon. There is no in Venice notes on these slides for stage direction, structure, symbolism. I'm just talking at them, but I know it does seem confusing because Crucible's got those notes. I'm very sorry. It's just a little text slip up, 2 different versions saved, and one is not the correct version, obviously. In terms of that symbolism of the Merchant of Venice, as I was saying, I'd always thought that Shylock was the Merchant of Venice because he's like a merchant banker, right? He sells stuff, kind of loans, and he feels like he's the main character. When I was researching for this lecture, I then saw a lot of stuff about, like, Antonio is the titular Merchant of Venice, and I was like, well, that makes sense. He's a merchant. He sails. He, like, sells stuff. And then I was like, it's kind of weird that you've got them both and we've got such an ambiguous title. So I think it probably is a bit of both. I think Shakespeare probably meant it to be Antonio, but wanted there to be a level of ambiguity, which is really interesting because most of Shakespeare's texts are like, you know, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Othello, Hamlet, the various Richards, the various Henrys. We do get like Much Ado About Nothing or Midsummer Night's Dream or The Tempest, but they tend to be very different genre text, again, with the exception of The Tempest, which is really interesting, right? So I would say it's a bit of both, and I think that the similarities between the two is kind of again, that demonstration of the fact that Antonio and Shylock are not so different as they appear to be. Okay, so let's talk a little bit in practice about this text. And how we're going to write about it, basically. So the key thing that I want to put out is, will everyone who registered get a copy of the lecture? If you mean slides, then yes. Oh, it might just actually be sent out to generic 800 Notes email database, to be honest. But yes, absolutely. We'll make sure all the slides get to you, don't worry. And thank you again, everyone, for your patience in terms of that. I'm very, very sorry again. So in practice, how are we going to write this essay? Well, the first thing I want to put out there is about the structure of an essay. So a lot of you, and it depends, so some of you, especially in New South Wales, may have had a bit of a weird assessment for this task. It may have been a multimodal or a speech or something like that. That was a bit maybe short. Maybe it was only 4-minute speech. You can only write about 600 words. If that sounds familiar-ish, I know that tends to be the option for quite a lot of people, unfortunately. So you've never written a full essay. Some of you have already in Queensland. That's fantastic. If you're in Victoria, you probably haven't necessarily started. A very common thing people fall into with a lot of texts, but especially Shakespeare texts, is that because sometimes the themes are a bit hard or they overlap a lot or because the language is a bit difficult, we do character paragraphs, right? You do one on Portia, one on Antonio, one on Shylock. Ideally, I want you to put that aside for now. The reason being twofold. The first is that, as I mentioned, relationships are very, very important in this text, right? Without the relationships, there's no real driving force. Why do you want to split up these relationships then, right? Indeed, Shylock is kind of connected to everything, even if he doesn't have a relationship with them. So his relationship with Antonio, his relationship with Jessica, they're the main ones, right? So if you then have a Shylock paragraph, you can no longer bring him up and analyze him in the other paragraphs, right? Because otherwise you're just repeating yourself. So it's twofold. It's one, out of the fact that relationships are key, but two, out of the fact that if you do character paragraphs, say that a couple of times fast, you will be probably kneecapping yourself a bit. You'll be limiting yourself in terms of what you're able to do, the complexity of the ideas you're able to express. So, to be clear, character paragraphs can be done well, especially when said character is linked to a theme. I've seen good ones. It's not like an automatic you're going to do badly type thing. However, they're not great. They work, they're good. They seem to be the basic option, but when you get into it, it's actually a lot harder to do really well. Themes, while they seem harder at first, are going to be most conducive to a good response and a well thought out response. So that's the first thing I want to put out there. It's very tempting because we have such clear, defined characters, but just think logically. Do I want to bring up Shylock more than 3 times in my essay? Probably. Obviously, you can't have a whole Shylock essay, but your interactions with Shylock, with Antonio, or whoever will be mixed in there. So, moving on to the other aspects of practice. As I mentioned, you may not want to make revenge a theme. You may want to link it to your whole thesis. It's really up to you. The key thing is, and I'm going to talk about New South Wales for a bit here, but hopefully it will still be enlightening for the other states, is for New South Wales, we're looking at human experiences, right? The experiences themselves, as you'll learn if you tune into Aditi's lecture tonight for English Advanced, are the themes. It's just a bit of a funky word. Human experiences are things that make up our lives, basically, which are generally going to be the themes of a text. As a result, the themes you pick, you want to be kind of universal and multifaceted. And that goes for everyone, right? So greed and wealth is a good one for this because it's obviously Shakespeare's communicating quite complex ideas. Same with relationships and isolation. In that case, revenge could also be a bit of a good one in terms of multifaceted. Was Shylock right in terms of hoping for revenge? In terms of your introduction and thesis, your biggest answer, and this goes for everyone, it is super relevant for New South Wales because it is key for human experiences, is what is the point of writing a text that contains a lot of key experiences? It is obviously to get obviously they can just be portraying it for funsies, but it's generally because Shakespeare wants the audience to do something. The portrayal of human experiences, given they have to be relevant to the author, otherwise he wouldn't have picked them, or they, in this case Shakespeare, is to hold a mirror up to society. Discrimination is rife. Revenge is rife. This is bad, basically. So your thesis needs to be about what Shakespeare wants the audience to do. Shakespeare portrays X, Y, and Z in order to force the audience to recognize the negative aspects in their own society and respond accordingly. Something like that. He's putting it out there and going, I'm about to tell you a story of a lot of complex people that do a lot of bad things. Listen up, 1. And 2, you need to not do this, basically. So it's to an extent a warning, and I actually think Merchant works on that quite well because he is warning. He's warning about the dangers of prejudice and how wrong it all could have gone. Okay. FYI, everyone, the updated slides will be available to download later on today. So not at the end of the week, but today. So come back to the exact same page. Again, I'm very sorry for that. Okay, that's your thesis. Your intro is going to have to talk about context. In this case, you also want to talk about Venice, but mainly about Shakespeare, rigid social structure, what he's trying to do. Get people to recognize that innate humanity in all of us, right? Then you go onto your thematic body paragraphs. That's kind of the key thing. That's going to be the rough outline. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is mainly it's not mainly a Shakespeare thing, that's a lie. It's an everything thing, but it tends to crop up a lot in Shakespeare because he weaves such intricate stories. So when you go about your analysis, it could be very common to say, you know, Shylock's soliloquy contains metaphor, blah, 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 thus highlighting the audience X, Y, Z. Pretty good. I'm pretending that the blah, blah, blah and the X, Y, and Z were great analysis. Pretty solid. However, you're ignoring the role of Shakespeare in that piece of analysis. So I want you guys to get into the habit of going, Shakespeare constructs X, Y, and Z, or Shakespeare's use of metaphor in Shylock's soliloquy. Rather than focusing on Shylock and his impact on the audience, it's about Shakespeare constructing Shylock to have an impact on the audience or another character. Why that's key for one, in human experience, is the rubric is all about representations, how text can represent human experiences. Representation goes very closely to construction, what the author has intended to represent. And in general, it's a really good habit to have. It is kind of the big thing I think I see in students that are in kind of pretty good, getting solid marks, 16 out of 20 type thing, moving them up to an 18, 19 out of 20. The biggest change you can make is by putting one step ahead. Author, content, audience, not content, audience. It's a minor change and it'll feel weird at first to do because it'll be like, okay, I'm just being more verbose. Like I'm just adding in words for the sake of it. I promise it is really worthwhile. Okay.